developed by the Frankfurt School. So really what we want to first do is obviously ask the question, what is critical theory? Now some of you may be hearing this approach for the first time. So let's look at a kind of basic definition. So critical theory, as conceived by the Frankfurt School, is a form of social critique that aims to understand and transform society by addressing the interplay of culture, economy, and power structures. It seeks not merely to interpret society, but to challenge and change oppressive structures. So, what do we think critical theory is about then? So, in its absolute simplest sense, critical theory is about a way of trying to study, a way of looking at society, but with a kind of underlying purpose, which is to uncover the power structures that are embedded within modern society, because it is believed that these power structures that exist in society, modern society, produce inequality, produce injustice, and oppression. So ultimately it's about working out how this all kind of operationalizes. Now, critical theory asks three important questions to modern society. So in essence, a modern audience, you and I, it asks three questions. The first question is why? Why is the world the way it is? Why do we have these power structures in place that create a gap, an inequality between wealth? Why do we have rich and poor? Why do we have a pay gap between men and women? Why is it that a lot of minorities exist on the periphery of society? So it's asking why. Why is the world the way it is? So it's the current modern world. Then it asks who benefits from this? So if these power structures exist, who benefits from these embedded power structures, this imbalance that exists within modern society? And the third question, perhaps most important question, is the how. How do we change this? Because in many ways what critical theory is about, it is about trying to actualize change for the betterment of humankind and society. It's not this kind of abstract analysis of society. It wants to improve society. Okay, so as I said, critical theory was developed by the Frankfurt School, and we're going to look at the history in the next couple of slides. But again, just to articulate some of the the kind of foundational points that kind of give it life, it's worth kind of noting some of these. So the first point is the critique of power and social structure. So we've kind of mentioned this, that the whole focus of critical theory is about examining modern society and the systems that control modern society. So capitalism, patriarchy, racial division. So these things provide forms of oppression, and therefore it's about working out the power, who controls it, how it operationalizes, and how it affects individual action and behavior. The other aspect, or the goal really, of critical theory is emancipation. What do we mean here that its goal is emancipation? So in simple terms, the goal is to empower marginalized voices, those that exist kind of submissive to the power structures, those on the periphery. It wants to basically actualize all individuals. And as we're going to find out, the key problem with modern society is that all of us have become kind of subjugated by the system and the structures, losing our kind of freedom and self-autonomy. The third and perhaps most significant aspect is that the Frankfurt School, through the lens of critical theory, wanted to establish this interdisciplinary approach. So it didn't want to just look at society from the lens of economics or even sociology. it wanted an inclusive approach. So it wanted to draw from across the spectrum of academia, from geography, from history, from literature, from sociology and so on. And it wants to bring together a common platform, the critique of society. How do we revitalize society using different perspectives? And the last point is that it wanted to challenge common sense. So in many ways, what this point is about, critical theory questions the ideas that we take for granted in modern society. So there are a host of ideas that we just take for granted. So for example, in a number of capitalist societies, there's this idea that if you work hard, you will have success. So all you need to do is basically work hard every day and you'll get the big house, you'll get the car and the fancy phone. What might be a problem with that assumption? That you simply just have to work hard and you'll be successful. What does it ignore? So as we know, it ignores the power structures that all of us are embedded within. So those people that basically grew up in poor inner city areas, deprived, lacking resources, lacking funding, lacking opportunities, are at the bottom of the socio-economic pyramid. And then someone else who was born in a middle-class family in the suburbs are going to have a different experience and set of opportunities. So it's easier for that person who's born in the middle-class suburbs to succeed compared to someone who's embedded at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So it's dangerous to make assumptions, and therefore one aspect of critical theory is to kind of explore the real essence of society. Okay, so perhaps this is what we should have started with, which is the background to critical theory. So critical theory, as established by the Frankfurt Institute, or commonly known as the Frankfurt School, it was established in 1923, and it was established in direct response to World War I. And in particular, because World War I is obviously a pivotal turning point in human history, because it's the first time the whole world went to war. You had the 6 or 7 leading nations go to war based on the breakup of the alliance system, and that was a major turning point, because that was a shock that we caused so much devastation and destruction. So in essence, it was very much an intellectual response to the First World War. And in particular, what critical theory wanted to do is understand modern society. Because if you look at modern society, it's immensely complex, right? Especially at the social level. The political level of modern society is very complex. And that is the reason why you have upheavals, why you have shifts and changes. And therefore, if modern society is extremely complex, due to its size, due to its complexity structures, then we need a new approach to understand it. So the modern society, the capitalist society, has come about, it's complex, it has all these upheavals. We need a new approach, i.e. critical theory, as the way to understand social reality in the modern. Now, so it was established in 1923. At the start, from 1923 to 1930, the focal point of the Frankfurt School was economics. And in particular, Marxist economics, the classical Marxist model, that basically the economic condition is the thing that creates change, right? And that was the focus. But by 1930, there was an intellectual shift in the Frankfurt School. And in particular, Max Horkheimer took over, and he shifted the focus of the Institute towards society, using a multidisciplinary approach to understand the complexities of society. Because in essence, there was, and we're going to talk about this intellectual shift from classical Marxism to something what we could call neo-Marxism. And so it was the realization that we need to actually focus on broader issues, not just economics. Economics is not the only thing that creates change. There's culture, there's ideology, there's other things that influence change. So, in essence, there was this intellectual shift. Then you have, in 1933, obviously the Nazis take power in Germany. Now, this is significant for a number of reasons. One, because most of the leading figures within the Frankfurt School had Jewish ancestry, and so it was a decision made by the director at the time to basically close the school and for most of the scholars to go into exile. A large number of them went to the US, where they took up positions in different institutions like Columbia and Berkeley. But what was interesting about this is exposed them to American society. So, in essence, this new society, new reality, new context helped shape their ideas, exposure to American culture. So, for example, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, for example, they settled in California, in America, and a lot of their work focused on this thing that we're going to look at, which is the culture industry. And it's because of that exposure that they developed that theory. Okay, so most return in 1950. So this is after the Second World War, and now we have a period of what? Reconstruction, right? Because of the devastation. And a lot of them come back with this effort of kind of post-war reconstruction. Now, it's important, because I said there was a kind of an ideological shift. We are going to talk about the ideological shift in the next slide, but there is a social context behind the shift from classical Marxism to neo-Marxism. And so we need to understand elements of the social context. And there's three significant points there. The first point is this issue of the failure or the defeat of working class revolutions. So you've got to understand, the people that formed the Frankfurt School were to some degree Marxist ideologues. They believed in the Marxist kind of model and ideology. But what starts to happen from the 19th century onwards is a lot of the working class movements fragment. Now the reason for this is because ultimately what happens is they don't actually establish their goals. So there is this kind of fragmentation that occurs within the proletariat revolutionary movement. So for example, look, you just had First World War, devastates Germany, they rebuild, and you have the Nazi regime come in, and then you have the Second World War, which absolutely devastates Germany. So from the 1900s onwards, a number of capitalist countries experienced immense economic hardship and economic turmoil. Yet, from all of that economic hardship, economic turmoil, there wasn't this kind of revolution based on the Marxist model. Yeah. So what that did is it kind of fragmented, or there was this disillusionment within the proletariat movement, right? And what then solidifies this disillusionment, fragmentation, and kind of disunity was the belief that the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 created a regression of socialist ideals. Now, how could that be? Because if we think about it, 1917, the establishment of the Soviet Union, that is this kind of pivotal kind of proletariat revolution that came from the bottom. This is the Leninist revolution, right, in 1917. So the Frankfurt School believed that the initial success of the Leninist revolution was optimistic because it brought about this proletariat, working class, grassroots upheaval. However, that soon faded. Why? Because of it turning into a totalitarian, authoritarian regime under Stalin. So what Stalin did is he created an authoritarian regime that was immensely bureaucratic. What that did then is it eroded the kind of egalitarian principles of socialist ideology. So what we're trying to say is the working class kind of fragmented as a movement. The Bolshevik Revolution caused basically a regression in terms of ideology. And then the third point, which is kind of the icing on the cake, is the rise of populist fascist regimes, which posed a direct opposition to socialist ideology. Now, the problem with fascism is that it posed a real kind of direct opposition. So why is fascism such a kind of competitor to socialist ideology? Well, if we look at the populist ideology, fascist ideology, it cuts across the social boundaries. So in many ways, the proletariat revolutionists appeal pretty much to the working class, to the proletariat. But fascist ideology, like Nazism and so forth, cut across social boundaries, economic boundaries. So it appealed to middle class as well as working class. It cut across also a large part of the social boundary. So in essence, it was in ways more popular than socialist ideology because it could penetrate and transcend popular kind of ideology amongst one demographic. So that caused another big kind of challenge for socialist ideology. All right? So you need to understand all of this context to understand the thinking behind the Frankfurt School and critical theory. So, to kind of explain then the ideology or the school of thought that underpins critical theory. So the first thing that we need to understand, and I know I mentioned it, is that the need for a renewed philosophy of history. So, in many ways, I said the Frankfurt School started as very much a kind of classical Marxist model, which is the idea that you have the infrastructure that is the fuel for change. Because what happens is the material condition changes when our technology gets better. And that changes the superstructure. The superstructure is what? Remind me again, what does the superstructure contain? What kind of things exist in the superstructure? So things like culture, ideology, politics, the media, all of these things, the monarchy, all of these things are superstructure. Now, what the Frankfurt School realized is that this kind of historical determinism was somewhat simplistic in the sense that it basically needed to be revitalized to apply to modern society. So when Marx conceived of it, there were different realities that emerged. So in essence, what happens is there is this need to revitalize Marxist ideology to modern situations. And what that meant was that not focusing just on the material economic lens, the Frankfurt School realized that culture, ideology, like fascist ideology, and authoritarian structures also influence the transformation of society. It's not just economic. So this is this idea of the kind of neo-Marxist perception where it's trying to modify the core aspects of Marxist ideology to consider that it's not just a single dynamic. Infrastructure influences superstructure. Rather, there can be interchange between the superstructure and infrastructure. So, for example, culture can influence the power structure. So how's that? So take, for example, in India, you have castes, right? You have 4 dominant castes in India. You have the Sudra, which is the labourer, the merchants, you have the warriors, and you have the religious class, the Brahmin. Now, what's interesting about the caste system in India, you would say that the Sudras at the bottom are your proletariat, and your merchant class or your bourgeoisie. They own the means of production. But these two groups are at the lower end of the class hierarchy. These groups have power and control, but yet they don't have the mode of production. So it's not basically governed by the mode of production, the class structure here. Rather, it's religion and culture that influences the power structure. So in essence, what is needed is a much more kind of revisited approach to Marx. So this is what we're talking about. So when we say the word critique of Marxism, the critical theory and the Frankfurt School wasn't necessarily a critique, because they're using or they're operating from the Marxist platform. They just want to revitalize it to kind of modern society and drawing, kind of reducing the kind of contradictions within it. Okay, so the third point here that we mentioned is a critique of traditional theory. So in particular, it's a critique of idealism and positivism. So this is a little bit puzzling, because these ideals came out of the Enlightenment. So these are post-Enlightenment ideals. Why this critical view of these kind of points? So if we took, for example, idealism first, idealism in its absolute simplest sense, is the view that ideas or concepts shape behavior, shape actions. And it's not material objects that influence the way we behave. It's not material objects that influence our ideas. So, for example, it's basically our ideas that make things real. So if you see a tree, the only thing that actually makes it real is when an individual perceives the tree and gives it meaning. That perception of the tree is the thing that makes it kind of real. It's not the object itself, it's the idea that this is a tree and what its function is. So in essence, that's idealism in its absolute simplest sense. Okay, what's the problem with that for the critical theory? The problem with this approach is it's abstract. It's trying to look at the ideal kind of society. So what society could be? It could be this grand thing, and it's abstract and it's philosophical, and it ignores the problems that exist in society now. So critical theory is very much about what is social reality now, how can we solve the problems that exist now, while idealism and other things are very much kind of abstract. Positivism then. This again, why positivism? Why a critique of positivism? Surely this is about studying society in an objective manner, right? So it's about measuring, recording, testing. The problem with kind of this approach of positivism is the objectivity aspect. See, you can put things under the microscope and detach yourself from it in a lab when you're studying biology or chemistry, right? So the natural sciences, you can be objective. Why can you not be objective when you study society? This is what the critical theory is saying, that you can't apply objectivity to understand society. Why? Well, you can do it in the lab, yeah.
Is it because it removes the individual from society?
Yeah, exactly. So it removes the individual, and what is contained within the individual is his experiences or her experiences, the interactions, the relationships. So in essence, you need actually a subjective approach that draws upon your experience, your life history, your interaction. So for example, feminist social theorists critique objectivity, because if you're trying to understand patriarchy, let's say in society, you can't switch off your personal experience, your embedment within, let's say, the patriarchal system, your experiences of it, the discrimination, etc. So in essence, that subjective experience is part of you. So you can't switch it off or deny it ever happened and look at something completely objectively, because society is too complex. We've experienced it, the interactions and so forth. So it's very difficult to have an objective study of society. Rather, you're going to always have elements of subjectivity within it. Okay, so the last point here is the critique of the culture industry, which I kind of mentioned. So what is the culture industry? The culture industry is the idea that cultural products have been commodified. So cultural products have been commodified. So what do we mean by that? Most of you after this lecture are probably going to go back home, listen to music, maybe put on a movie, watch a TV show. These are all cultural products that carry within it specific meaning that can actually manipulate society. So the big point here about the culture industry is the idea that basically what they were talking about when it was Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer who wrote and theorized a lot about the culture industry. What they suggested the culture industry does is it creates this idea or this phenomenon of cultural standardization. So what is cultural standardization? In its simplest sense, it takes products and it creates them according to kind of a set formula that is most appealing to a wider audience. So, okay, take an example. Hollywood, yeah? Hollywood make all these summer blockbusters, right? A lot of these summer blockbusters are literally the same kind of plot and the same kind of structure. Why? Why are these movies pretty much generic? The superhero movies or the disaster movies, why do you make products, these movies, that are essentially generic in plot and structure? They follow the same theme. So you have the hero's journey, you have the romantic subplot, you have a happy ending. Why? What is the purpose of creating a product, multiple products like this, that have cultural standardization embedded within it? Well, you're trying to create a product, a movie, that has mass appeal, because that is the thing that will increase profits. So it's driven by profit. You want to make the most profit. The best way to do it is to make a movie that everyone in society will go see. You want to cut across, you want it to be popular for, the working class, the middle class, educated, non-educated. You want to cut across the social base. If you create a movie that's niche, that might be really good and artistic and really memorable, but it's very kind of niche and not popular, then it won't be profitable. So, a good movie is not determined by its artistic creativity and uniqueness, it's determined by popularity and the kind of generic features of it, and profit. So what they're critiquing about the culture industry is the idea that basically the culture industry stifles our creativity, our uniqueness, our autonomy, and our freedom. So it can be damaging. Okay, so another key work of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno is the book The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And they state within it, the Enlightenment has always aimed at liberating men from fear and establishing their sovereignty. Yet the fully enlightened earth radiates disaster triumphant. What are they trying to say here? So this again is somewhat surprising, because what they're trying to actually say, and they articulate within the book, is that something like reason, which is a good thing, right? Because in the Enlightenment, or at the Enlightenment period, reason was the instrument, the tool that liberated us from the shackles of religion. Religion had restricted our thinking, and it basically attached us to religious dogma. And reason came along and freed us, liberated us. It allowed the mind to be the source of our judgment, our morality, our law. So why is this a problem? Well, if you think about it, okay, so let's say you have religion, the Bible, for example. The Bible says, in Genesis, I think, it says there was a universal flood. Yeah? So there was a universal flood, and the people adopt that. They think that is true, because their reason is restricted by the higher authority and religious dogma. Now reason comes along and basically allows us to question truth. It allows us to question the conception of the real. And so, for example, if we apply reason to this idea that there was a universal flood, it doesn't make sense. So, for example, did the universal flood take place? Well, for it to have taken place, you would basically have to submerge the entire planet underwater, right? Now, the highest point on Earth is Mount Everest, which is what, 29,000 feet. Now, to fill the Earth, and it's at its highest point, requires 8 times the current amount of water we have. So you have to multiply the planet's water by 8 to submerge the entire planet. So that's 8 times of the current volume of water. Now, if you did that, cutting a long story short, what's going to happen? You're going to radically increase the mass of the Earth, and it will fall out of orbit, and we all die. So reason allowed us to free ourselves from religious dogma. Now, the problem is, in the modern, reason becomes dominated by destructive tendencies. So this is what they're suggesting. Earlier, reason helped liberate us, emancipate us from religious dogma. But in capitalist society, modern society, reason is the thing that is enslaving us, is dominating us. So how does it do that? Well, there's 2 types of reason. There is substantive reason and there is instrumental reason. So if we look at substantive first, substantive reason, in its simplest sense, is about the end value. The end value. So it's about why you perform the action. So the goal of the action is to attain an end value. So to do something good, a common good, to do something for freedom or equality. So it's doing an action for the end value. Okay, that's the reason why you do the act. So for example, if you're a lawyer, instead of wanting to make lots of money being a criminal lawyer, you engage in human rights advocacy because you want to help marginalized communities. So you're not doing it for money, you're doing it to provide justice to those that might not be able to receive it or access it. So it's a substantive reason that you're doing that, yeah? So it's basically the end value. If you look at instrumental reason, on the other hand, instrumental reason is to do the action based on short-term goal. So it's basically about efficiency, it's about calculation, and it ignores end value. So the reason why you do something is purely for the efficiency of it. So in essence, you're doing it for basically profit. You're doing it for the reason, the act, how the act is done. That's your kind of focus. So in essence, some of the examples of this would be, say for example, say if you wanted to, let's look at some of these examples here. Take for example, an example of instrumental reason with new surveillance technology. Surveillance technology is very efficient in the means of tracking people, right? It can track people, their movement, in an effective way. So if governments want to track us, they have developed technology to do it. Now, the reason why it's instrumental reason is because they're ignoring any value, any ethical consideration, such as if this is an invasion, infringement of our privacy, right? So they don't care about, this is going to infringe privacy, we're going to basically need to track people, so we're going to just implement this technology because it's the most efficient way of tracking people. Or think of pharmaceutical companies, yeah? They produce all this medication. Now, to produce a lot of these pills and drugs, it actually costs very little, but they charge a huge amount for it. And so the reason for that, the reason why they're charging this huge amount is because of the instrumental reason that they want to make profit. They're not doing it for a substantive reason, which would be for the welfare of people, to make sure that people are healthy. So in essence, they're driven by profit. which affects that aspect of reason and why we do it. So you could look at other examples like the arms industry and so forth. Okay, I know we're running out of time. So if we look at this aspect of, so you have substantive reason, instrumental reason. The relationship between these two forms of reason, according to the Frankfurt School, is it's a dialectical relationship. So what do they mean by that? Well, substantive reason represents freedom and autonomy, and instrumental reason represents basically domination and control. So they're on the same spectrum, and they interrelate and they influence each other. But what they argue is that in the modern, what's happened is we've become much more instrumental in our reason. So that's causing us to be dominated by capitalist society, right? So this is not a good thing. So in essence, what we see is there is this kind of, like I said, interplay. So if we take, for example, instrumental reason reduces us, human beings, in a capitalist system to a resource. So for example, things like you have factory farming, right? So factory farming has no end value kind of consideration. We need to feed as many people and make a huge profit. So we're going to basically stick all these chickens into a closed room. They're never going to see daylight. We don't care about animal welfare. So if you were looking at it from a substantive reason perspective, you would want to basically have an end value, which is animal welfare. But that's ignored for profit. So you can see that these kind of things have this kind of devastating effect, right? Now, if we look at another kind of set of examples, right? So if we look at substantive and instrumental, and say, take a few examples. Let's say the tech industry. The tech industry, social media, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, it uses advanced algorithms to basically give us all this information, right? But it would be instrumental reason if they basically just focused on profits and all they care about is getting as many users. So they don't mind if there is a lot of users spreading misinformation, which causes riots like it did. They don't care. So a substantive way of looking at it would be that you need basically ethical protocols that look after the kind of welfare of the user. Or take, for example, the climate change, or the climate crisis. Instrumental reason are happy, it's capitalists are happy to extract fossil fuels. Even though fossil fuels, it's been proven, are going to destroy the planet. But because it's the short-term goal and it's not connected to end value, we need to extract fossil fuels because we want to make profit. So substantive reason would look at that problem and say, no, we need to transition to sustainable energy sources. Why? Not because necessarily it's going to fix today, but it's going to prevent the future generations having a climate crisis. All right? So it's that end value. Okay, so moving to Max Horkheimer. I'm just going to kind of go through his arguments relatively quickly because we're running out of time. So he states here, after a period of progress, development of human powers and emancipation of the individual, after enormous extension of human control over nature, finally hinders further development and drives humanity into a new barbarism. So what is he trying to say here? So Horkheimer is one of the more pivotal figures of the Frankfurt School and critical theory. He basically explores, his kind of focus in many ways is looking at the contradictions embedded within capitalism. And in particular, his focus is the shift from substantive to instrumental. Because what happened is, in the modern and capitalist society, we are much more instrumental in our reason, And that impacts and changed the way we live and interact. So it impacts us. So, and this is what he refers to as the paradox of progress. So you have all this development under capitalism, right? You've got TV, satellites, all this internet technology. This is progress. But the problem with all this progress is that it dehumanizes us and it exploits us. So this is the paradox of progress, that you have all this progress from capitalism, but the kind of byproduct is we become alienated and we kind of lose our sense of meaning and all of these things. So this is his kind of focus in many ways, that he's talking about the danger of capitalist society. And he talks about the commodity economy, where in essence what happens is goods, services, as we talked about before, become commodified. And the danger of that is human values are subverted for the market economy forces, right? And that's what he considers as this kind of new barbarism. So this is why sewage companies in the UK, for example, are happy to dump all their sewage into our water supplies, polluting it. Why? Because of profit. So what we see is this kind of danger within modern capitalist society that he's talking about. Okay, Herbert Marcuse, another significant scholar of the critical theory Frankfurt School, in his book Civilization, argues that, in simple terms, civilization works in service of eros, but is based on the ongoing subjugation of the human drives. Okay, eros, in its simplest sense, is your life instinct. This is love, creativity, passion comes from it. But the problem is that Western capitalist society is built on subjugating eros. It's built on subjugating human drives. So if your love-affirming instinct is being suppressed by the capitalist system, that will create suffering. So in essence, to maintain the kind of order and productivity, eros is subjugated. So what we have then is basically your eros is subjugated, this kind of, like I said, this kind of life instinct, love, freedom. That's basically suppressed and it's channeled towards something called thanatos, which is basically your destructive instinct. Things like aggression, things like destruction. So we're channeled, we're not fully following our life instinct, our eros. We're basically being pushed by capitalist society to follow thanatos, which basically is quite destructive. So for example, take this idea of a work ethic, right? It's instilled within us, this work ethic, that basically you've got to get a job and work hard. So 9 to 5, not for a day or a week. You do this until basically you're like 65 years old. Now what he argues is that we're basically prioritizing work over eros, over pleasure. So in essence, we're basically destroying ourselves because we're engaging in activity that is not built around the life instinct. So in essence, what he's saying, this is the cause of suffering. And ultimately, what happens is this idea of renunciation or delayed gratification. So in essence, what he's saying is capitalist society suppresses our eros and gives us the idea that we need to delay our short-term goals for greater satisfaction that will happen. So, get a job, slave for 30, 40, 50 years, and then you'll retire at 65, and that's where you'll be free and you'll be able to enjoy yourself. This is trying to delay your gratification. So work hard, but the problem is that you're working in a job where you're not getting any recognition, your creativity is not recognized, you're just simply a cog in the larger wheel, right? You're devalued, your humanity is devalued in these work situations. Why? Because you're viewed as a resource, as a commodity, and therefore this whole system, the capitalist system, is reinforcing or basically suppressing your true eros. And in essence, it's destructive as a result. Is there any questions so far? Okay, I know we've quite run out of time. I'll just quickly summarize the last kind of slide. There are a few others, but Theodor Adorno, another significant scholar in the Frankfurt School and part of the critical theory movement, argued, very importantly, that human society is not yet human. So what he was arguing is that modern society, if you look at capitalist society, has not yet fully actualized its kind of humanness. And the reason for this is because modern society in many ways fails to foster human values. Again, because we are like a cog in the wheel, right? So what he's basically arguing is that capitalism dehumanizes us. The social relationships that we have, that we build, are basically dehumanized. He also argues that institutions have become too large, and in essence, these institutions that were meant to serve us, serve our needs, now basically control us and dominate us. So, I know we've probably run out of time, so I'm not going to go on. But what is significant about the critical theory approach method is that it provided a way to critique modern capitalism using the kind of Marxist framework, but expanding it to look at things like culture, things like ideology. So it provided a significant alternative way of looking at and critiquing society, especially modern society. So this is why critical theory is very influential in social theory, and it's worth kind of, for that reason, looking at. Okay, so on Friday we will look at structuralism.